Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. I'm Will England, editor-in-chief of Rock Solid Apologia, and joining me today is Christian apologist and Stand to Reason speaker Alan Shlemon. Alan Shlemon has worked as an author and speaker for Stand to Reason since 2004. He trains Christians to share their convictions in persuasive yet gracious manner. Alan teaches about some of the most controversial issues of our time: abortion, evolution, homosexuality, bioethics, and Islam. He has been a guest on both radio and television and has spoken to thousands of adults and students across the country at churches, conferences, and college campuses. He also said in the lecture I just listened to that he has a spiritual gift of sarcasm, so we should get along great. Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, Mr. Shlemon. It's so terrific to have you.
Thanks. It's a privilege to be on this show.
So, wanted to talk a little bit about Islam today.
Okay.
Could you give us a little bit of your background with Islam?
Well, many years ago, Stand to Reason needed somebody to specialize on the topic of Islam. So they asked me, partly because my family is from the Middle East. They were not Muslims. My family are a part of a small Christian minority called Assyrians from Iraq. And so they fled Iraq, came to the States back in the late 60s. And so because of that, I have probably a better understanding of Middle Eastern culture than the average person at Stand to Reason. So they said, hey, why don't you be the one who focuses on Islam? So after that, I studied a little bit more formally Islam at Biola University, and then did some of my own research as well. And then since then, I've been teaching Christians about Islam and equipping them with tactics to engage Muslims. I routinely take Christians to mosques in the United States and in the Middle East. Every year I go to the Middle East and teach Arab Christians as well. So I've just become just kind of more familiar with Arabs and the Middle East and Islam through those experiences.
So we're already slightly off script, but I am curious, what happens at a mosque?
Well, I specifically pick the times when there's going to be the largest number of Muslims at the mosque, which would be on a Friday. So, you probably heard, like, for Christians, like, Sunday's our big day where we go to a church. For Jews, it's Saturday, and for Muslims, it's Friday. And so they have an extended time of prayer on Fridays, and they also usually have their service then. So typically we go and time our arrival so that we can watch the entire service. And usually that service consists of a type of sermon or message from the imam or some speaker, guest speaker there. And then they do some formal prayers. And the prayers are the things that usually, like if you're watching a movie that shows some Muslims, you'll hear a person like singing verses of the Quran or calling people to pray, and they'll bow and they'll kneel and they'll stand back up. And so all of that takes place during the service. After the service is over, they do those prayers. And then usually we ask one of their scholars or the imam to present to us some reasons why we should become Muslim, so that we have a chance to engage in a back and forth conversation with those Muslims.
Is there such a thing as like a Quranic exposition or Quranic exegesis? Like, does the imam get up there and go through the Quran, or is that not how a typical mosque service goes?
Yes, it's exactly what they do. They'll usually cite from authoritative sources whatever message they want to communicate. So maybe that day's message is about prayer, or maybe it's about fasting, or maybe it's about giving money to others, or caring for the poor. And what they'll do is they'll cite from the Quran, which is, according to them, the literal words of Allah and their highest authority. Then they'll cite from the sayings and teachings of Muhammad, and this is called hadith literature. So they'll cite different hadiths. And they'll also usually cite some from his biography, the The Sunnah, which is the life example of Muhammad, that is also considered to be authoritative. And so they'll say, hey, Muhammad did this, so we should do this as well. So they'll incorporate all those elements in that service.
So that transitions wonderfully. Talked a little bit, wasn't planned, but about the mosque service. What big picture is involved with being a Muslim, specifically the 6 articles of faith?
Yeah, so the 6 articles of faith are required doctrinal positions. So you've probably heard of the 5 pillars of Islam. Those are behaviors that they must do. The 6 articles of faith are required doctrinal beliefs. So, for example, they're required to believe that there is only one God, right? They're required to believe in God's angels. They're required to believe in God's books. They're required to believe in God's prophets. They're required to believe in God's final judgment. And they're required to believe in God's divine destiny or predestination. So these 6 articles are required doctrinal positions. And I mean, I usually teach about them. I think 4 of them are perhaps the most relevant for my interests, because oftentimes when I go to a mosque with other Christians, I'm trying to help these Christians engage in a conversation that will lead to the gospel. So I tend to focus on just 4 of those key doctrines.
So just briefly, give an overview of those 4 that you like to focus on specifically.
Yeah, so one of them is the belief in God's angels. I think this is relevant because in Islam, they teach that angels follow each and every person throughout your entire life. And one angel keeps track of all your good deeds, and one angel keeps track of all your bad deeds. Okay, and that's important because another required doctrine in Islam is the belief in the final judgment. And this says that at the time when the final judgment occurs, everyone will be resurrected and everyone will be judged according to their deeds. And how will we know what good and bad deeds you've committed? Well, those angels, right, will bring forth all the good and bad deeds and put them on a scale. If your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to heaven. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. So they have a meritorious-based system of salvation, which means that whether you go to heaven or hell is based on your works, or your good or bad works, right? So belief in the angels is one. Belief in the final judgment is another required article. The third one that I focus on is the belief in God's prophets. And the reason why I think that's significant for our purposes as Christians is that a lot of people that are mentioned in the Bible turn out to be prophets in Islam. So they believe that, like, say, Adam was a prophet of Allah, Jonah, Moses, David, Jesus is even a prophet of Allah. So what that means is, for the Muslim, they are required to believe in Jesus as a prophet. Now, as you probably know, they don't believe that Jesus is the same person that we believe in. Like, they deny he's part of the Trinity. They deny he's the Son of God. And in fact, for them to believe either one of those will be to commit the most grievous sin in Islam, which is called the sin of shirk, which will guarantee you to go to hell forever. Okay, so do not pass go, do not collect 200, right? Go directly to hell, right? For all those of you who play Monopoly, okay? So anyway, so belief in the God's prophets is essential. Again, their Christology is different than ours, but they still have to believe in Jesus, and that's significant. And then the fourth required belief that I think is important for our purposes is that they are required to believe in all of God's books. Now, the Quran identifies 4 books or 4 divine revelations by name. The Quran identifies the Quran. So the Quran refers to itself as a divine revelation from Allah given to the Prophet Muhammad. The Quran identifies the Torah also as a true revelation given to the Prophet Moses. The Quran identifies the Psalms, it's called the Zabur, as also a true revelation from Allah given to the Prophet David. And most interestingly, for our purposes, the Quran identifies the Gospel, it's called the Injil, as a true revelation from Allah given to the Prophet Jesus. So now, the obvious question comes up then, well, wait a minute. If Muslims are commanded to believe in the gospel, well, the gospel teaches that Jesus claimed to be God, which they reject. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John claim that Jesus was crucified and rose again, which the Quran rejects, right? The Gospels, claim that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, like all these things. And so you're like, okay, well, how do Muslims reconcile the fact that the Quran commands them to believe in the gospel, and yet they reject all these elements that are taught in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
So there's a few things to go further into. We've got 4 pillars that are most important for our purposes. Belief in
4 articles of faith.
Yes, 4
There's
articles.
5 pillars.
Right.
Yeah,
sorry.
that's all right.
5 pillars and then 6 articles of faith.
Right.
And then we've got we've got belief in God's angels. We've got belief in the final judgment. We've got belief in God's prophets, and we've got belief in the books.
Right.
So let's go specifically into belief in God's books. You said Torah, Psalms, Gospel, and Quran.
Yes.
This goes into your approach for negotiating or navigating a conversation with Muslims. How would you go about using belief in Allah's books to point people towards the gospel? And then maybe we'll dive into a little bit more why you favor this particular approach.
Oh, well, so because I know they are commanded to believe in the gospel, what I do is I try to get into a conversation where I can talk to them about what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John teach. And the way I get into that is I ask them a question that is going to help me get into a conversation where I can share the gospel. And here's the key question. Are you 100% certain you're going to heaven? Now, notice I don't ask, are you confident or are you sure? I ask, are you 100% certain? Now, no Muslim has ever said to me, yes. What they always say is, well, not 100% certain. And of course, the reason why is because remember that one teaching, it says, well, you're saved according to your deeds, good and bad deeds. But they don't know what the angels are going to bring, right? They don't know what good and bad deeds the angels are going to bring and how those deeds are weighted. So they can't have confidence they'll be saved, right? So my immediate follow-up question is, well, would you like to have 100% certainty? Now, at this point, either they do want to have certainty or they're just curious. Like, what is this? What is this Christian going to say? Like, come on,
How does this guy think he knows?
Exactly. So this is where I leverage the fact they're required to believe in the gospel. And I say to them this, have you ever read Jesus and what he says? Because he's a prophet in your theology. So he's authoritative. And in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he speaks. So what I do is I point them to John 3, verses 16 through 18. Okay. Now, here's the reason why I point them, or why I tell Christians to point them to this. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but I like John 3, 16 through 18 because number one, virtually every Christian is going to remember that citation. Because John 3:16 is one of the most famous passages in the scriptures, right? So most Christians remember that. I just encourage the Christian to go 2 additional verses, include 17 and 18, because there Jesus talks about, that, if you believe in the Son of God, you'll be saved. If you reject the Son of God, you won't be saved, and so on and so forth. So Jesus is speaking and he's communicating the message of reconciliation. So that's one advantage to that passage, is that the Christian's going to remember it. Number 2, it's Jesus speaking, who he's a prophet in Islam. And number 3, it's from the Injil, which is the gospel revelation. So that's why I like pointing them to that. So now, look, in under 60 seconds after asking them, would you like to have 100% certainty? I'm now talking about sharing the message of reconciliation. Now, okay, go ahead.
So it gets you to the gospel the fastest.
Exactly. I tend to want to focus on the gospel, and there's lots to talk about with a Muslim. I mean, you could talk about, marriage and divorce and jihad and polygamy and treatment of women and the Quran and you can go on forever. But at the end of the day, what matters is what are they going to do with Jesus, right? And after all, even if they were to accept your views about, say, jihad or something, well, guess what? Their eternal destinies is still in jeopardy.
Right.
Because agreeing with you about jihad or about the treatment of women or whatever isn't going to save them. What's going to save them is if they get reconciled to God, and only through Jesus Christ. So that's why I asked the question, are you 100% certain? No? Would you like to have 100% certainty? Okay, let me point you to John 3, 16 through 18 and hear the words of Jesus.
So there's another series of questions I think you use to point people towards the gospel, and you use Surah 5, 43 through 47, but specifically Surah 5:47. What does Surah 5:47 say, and how does this lead you towards the gospel?
Yeah, so Surah 5:46-47 is the citation specifically. And the reason why it's significant is because when you quote to a Muslim or have them read from the Gospel of John, the words of Jesus, their immediate reaction is going to be, well, the gospel and the Bible in general is corrupted. It's been changed. So I can't really trust what I'm reading are the words of Jesus here, because either you Christians and Jews intentionally changed the Bible, or as a result of your irresponsibility, you allowed it to get corrupted. So this is a problem. In fact, it's the number one objection you will run across when talking to a Muslim. I don't care what Muslim you're talking to, whether you're talking to one in the States or in the Middle East. Virtually every Muslim believes the gospel is corrupted, and more broadly, the Bible is corrupted. Now, I'm not so concerned about what they believe about, say, the book of Isaiah or, I don't know, even 2 Corinthians, okay? But I am concerned about what they think about the gospel, because where are the words of Jesus found? Where is Jesus's sort of self-revelation and description of the message of reconciliation found? In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that's the very source of authority the Muslim's going to say, I can't accept it. You got to take that off the table as we talk about Jesus. So what I realize is, unless you address this issue of authority, you are not going to go very far with the Muslim. Because at the end of the day, if you want to tell them who Jesus is and his message of reconciliation, you need to be able to explain it from the Gospels, which they say is corrupted. Well, here's what I've discovered. Although Muslims will say the gospel is corrupted, it turns out their Quran, which is the highest authority in Islam, teaches the opposite, that the gospel is the uncorrupted word of Allah. And the way I've gotten that is to discover that the Quran teaches three things about the gospel. Number one, the Quran teaches that the gospel is a revelation from Allah. It's a divine revelation from Allah. Number two, the Quran teaches that the gospel was present and available in the 7th century when Muhammad was writing and talking, or when he was talking. And number three, the Quran teaches that the gospel is authoritative, which means it should be believed and obeyed. Now, there are dozens of passages that support those 3 points. But the nice thing about Surah 5, verses 46-47, is that in just one passage, in those just 2 verses, all of those 3 components are affirmed. That the gospel is a divine revelation, available in Muhammad's time, and also authoritative, meaning it should be believed and obeyed. And so what I'm going to do is point the Muslim to their own authority. Hey, do you got a Quran? You know, it's like, hey, if not, let me show you here on my phone, this iQuran app. Look what it says. And that passage affirms all 3 things. So now I'm leveraging their highest authority to make the point that they cannot claim that the gospel is corrupted, because according to the Quran, the highest authority, it teaches that Muslims are supposed to believe and obey the gospel. Well, how can they be commanded to believe and obey it if it's corrupted? Right. That makes absolutely no sense. And again, in my teaching on this, I mean, I point to dozens of passages that over and over and over again affirm that the gospel is a revelation from Allah. It should be believed and obeyed. It commands Christians to believe and obey it. It's like, okay, well, how are we supposed to believe and obey the gospel if it's corrupted? That makes no sense. The only reason that the Quran commands that is because it believed that the gospel was trustworthy and reliable in the 7th century when Muhammad was around.
So Surah 5:47 specifically is like, if Christians want to memorize one passage of the Quran, Surah 5:47 would be the passage to memorize and just know by heart.
Yeah, and actually what I do is I have a whole bunch of these passages just written down on notes on my phone, or or just saved on a Quran app. And that way, if I'm ever in a conversation, just pull it up. Because you really want them to read it, because also the Quran app has the Arabic next to it. And a lot of Muslims will object if you read it in English. So I like to have the Arabic there so they can just read it right in Arabic and see, oh, I'm not misinterpreting this, or they can read the context or so on and so forth. But yes, Surah 5, 46 to 47, I particularly like.
Would you say that question about salvation and then the question about Surah 5, 46 to 47 are your two most common tactics when engaging with Muslims?
Well, yeah. So this whole idea of using the Quran
Mhm.
to leverage my point that the gospel is not corrupted, that's a tactic. I would say, the overall strategy is this. You start with the question, are you 100% sure you're going to heaven? If not, you point to what Jesus says in John 3:16 through 18. If they object that it's corrupted, you use the Quran to eliminate the objection. And then once you've eliminated the objection, you go back to John 3:16 through 18. So your whole goal is to get to the words of Jesus from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I like John 3:16 through 18, but you can do whatever you want in terms of what passages in the Gospels you want to highlight.
So very, very gospel-centric approach.
Yeah, because I think that's what matters the most.
Right.
Plus, if you get off on these tangents about jihad, polygamy, whatever it might be, there's a lot of weeds there. And the average Christian, I think, probably will feel overwhelmed to know how to navigate those conversations. So if you want to really focus like on one area, to me, that one question, what does the Quran say about the gospel and how their highest authority affirms the trustworthiness and reliability of the gospel? To me, that tactic is huge and that question's huge.
So I wanted to ask you this specifically because of your very, very gospel-centric approach to discussing with Muslims. Let's say a Christian does find themselves in over their head on a discussion about polygamy or Aisha or jihad.
Right.
How would you encourage a Christian to navigate those conversations?
Well, I encourage them not to start them in the first place.
Okay.
So I mean,
first off, avoid them.
Yeah. What I say is this: focus on the gospel and avoid conversations that distract from the gospel. Because here's what's going to happen: if you start talking about jihad or Muhammad when he was in his 50s, married a girl when she was just 6, right? What you're going to find is the Muslims going to have their defenses raised and they'll become very defensive. And now they're less likely to hear other things you want to say when it comes to the gospel. So why raise the defenses of a Muslim when before you've even brought up the gospel? It's like, that's not my approach. Again, if you want to do that, it's fine, but I'm just saying the way I teach it is skip jihad, skip Aisha, skip, criticizing the Quran. I mean, look, I've studied the Quran, I've read the Quran, I've studied about the manuscripts, I've studied the ancient scripts and styles of writing of the Quran. Like, I know all about this stuff. I don't usually bring it up ever with a Muslim. I'm bringing up my emphasis on what Jesus says is the way to heaven, the way to salvation, and it's only through him. That's what I want them to contend with. Besides, if they eventually put their trust in Christ, well, guess what happens to all their views about jihad and Aisha? And well, all those, of course, will just dissipate eventually, because now they have the Holy Spirit in them. They'll be convicted of sin. They'll be convicted of the truth.
It's also interesting. I've listened to some apologists that are dealing with Islam, and they try and approach some of these issues from a moral stance.
Mm-hmm.
Like you look at jihad or you look at polygamy and you say these things are immoral, which always has struck me as an interesting approach, because it's like if we as Christians hold to the moral argument that God grounds morality, if Allah is real, it is by definition moral if he says it's moral. So it's interesting to critique, because it's like that's a valid critique when you establish that our source of morality is elsewhere.
Right.
It's not a valid source of critique if Allah is the
source of morality.
Right.
Right. Which you're right. In the Quran, it commands people to engage in violent jihad.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't say, well, that's immoral if, like you said, Allah commands you to do it. In fact, there's 164 verses about violent jihad in the Quran, right? And I've picked up a Quran that was published from Saudi Arabia. And the reason why I like it is because in Saudi Arabia, they don't care about being politically correct. Like you pick up a Quran from like some bookstore here in the United States, or even go to a mosque here in the United States, they're going to give you a Quran that the English has been kind of almost watered down when in those more controversial passages. You get one from the Saudi Arabia, they don't water it down. They just say it like it is, right? And in fact, the end of the Quran from the one that I got from Saudi Arabia, they have an appendix where all they do is they say this: hey, if you missed the clear teaching of jihad in the Quran, let us now remind you that jihad is a pillar in Islam, not just the 5 pillars, but this is a pillar. And if you try to evade your requirement to engage in jihad, you should die like the hypocrites. And it goes on and on and on. It's like, whoa. Well, so yeah, I mean, if the Muslims deriving their moral authority from Allah and the Quran commands that, then it's by definition morally permissible. So you're right. You'd have to come at it from a different angle. You'd have to hope that the Muslim is like super uncomfortable with the fact that the Quran commands jihad. But if I were a Muslim, I'd be like, well, God commands it. He said it. That settles it, like, right. So what's your problem? You'd have to, like you said, argue from Yahweh's moral stance, which is expressed in the Bible, that such behavior is wrong.
I've also heard it expressed, and I'd be curious on your opinion on this. And it's been a while since I read it, but like in Nabil Qureshi's testimony, he talks about how he was so confident in Islam that some of his Islamic beliefs had to be shaken before he could even consider the gospel. There was a sense in which it's like, well, yes, what I'm being presented with is wonderful, but until some of the problems with the Quran are exposed, or some of the problems with Muhammad are exposed, he wouldn't even consider it, if I'm remembering correctly.
Right. Well, yes, and that would be the value of studying additional apologetics when it comes to Islam. So what I'm teaching is, hey, look, if you have a limited amount of time and you got only the time of study, I'd say focus on this approach. Now, is it good to know about the Quran, its compilation, its transmission, source criticism? Absolutely. It's fantastic. And the evidence against why we should reject the Quran as the true word of Allah is legion, right? So yeah, of course, if you know that, it's great. But not everybody has the resources to spend that much time and get into the weeds about source criticism with the Quran or textual transmission. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love that stuff and I study it, but for the most part, if I'm just trying to teach the average believer, hey, how can you have the confidence to get into a productive conversation with a Muslim? I'm going to go with this gospel-centered approach.
One other question about jihad that tends to come up, and again, it's so interesting to ask you as someone who doesn't use this as their primary apologetic approach versus, say, some of the other guests we've had on the podcast. What is the difference between violence in the Quran and the Hadith versus violence in the Old Testament?
Well, probably 3 major differences. Number one, violence in the Old Testament was, or in waging war in the Old Testament, was usually or typically a means of judgment by God against the wicked people. So, for example, you have the Canaanites, right? For 400 years, the Canaanites engaged in wicked behavior, like sacrificing children on hot altars. I mean, these people weren't just like, cyber stalking people on Facebook, right? Or writing, nasty posts on their wall. Like, the Canaanites were just doing incredibly wicked things. And God waits patiently for 400 years for them to repent, and they never do. And finally, God says, enough is enough. And he uses Israel as an instrument of judgment to wipe out the Canaanites. So war is used in the Old Testament, and killing in the Old Testament as a means of God judging wicked people for their sin. Now, what's interesting to note, by the way, is that when God was willing to do that, he was also willing to use other nations, other people groups like the Assyrians, my people, as an instrument of judgment against Israel when Israel sinned. So notice, God was an equal opportunity judger. He judges sin regardless of who commits it. That is not parallel to jihad in Islam, because jihad in Islam is only is used as a means of wiping out the enemies of Muhammad and the Muslims, being able to expand the Islamic empire. Whereas we don't see war and judgment used as a war and killing in the Old Testament as a means of expanding the religion, where it was used in Islam to expand the Islamic empire and conquer people and convert them to Islam. So that's the first major difference, is that the purpose of war and killing is for a different thing. Second major difference is this: war and killing in the Old Testament is descriptive, not prescriptive, meaning it describes what happened, but it doesn't prescribe what is supposed to happen.
Was it prescriptive, though, in and of the sense that God prescribed it at that particular time?
Yes, but I mean, it's not prescriptive for us as Christians today.
Okay.
In other words, there's no theology that takes the commands for Joshua to go and attack that you can apply that be, oh, well, since Joshua did X, Y, and Z, I can now go to, I don't know, to Mexico or Canada or Italy or whatever and like start waging war. Like, there's no theology, there's no seminary, there's no church that makes that behavior in the Old Testament as normative for Christians today. However, in the Quran, there is a very vibrant and robust theology that says that the teachings of jihad are normative and prescriptive for today. In fact, that's one of the arguments that Muslims make, is that your Old Testament is irrelevant. Why? Because there's all these passages that are not applicable anymore. Whereas we Muslims, they'll say, we have the Quran that says any passage in the Quran can be acted upon at any time and any place, right? So, so jihad is a robust theology that is still present amongst Muslims today. And by the way, going back to that Quran I got from Saudi Arabia, there's a verse that says in the Quran, it says, "Make ready your steeds of war." And what they have done is they've then added some extra words that are not found in the original Arabic to help you understand what this command in the Quran says. And here's the words they added. It says, "Make ready your steeds of war," and they add planes, tanks, missiles, artillery.
Sheesh.
So notice, they believe that that command to make ready your steeds of war is definitely applicable today because there were no planes, missiles, tanks, and artillery back in the 7th century. So you know, they think that this is relevant for today, for sure. And again, they make a whole apologetic in the Quran as to why you're supposed to continue to engage in jihad, and to flee from that obligation is to you deserve them to die like a hypocrite, basically is what it says. So anyways, all that being said, the second major difference between the Old Testament killing and the Quran and jihad is that one's descriptive, whereas the other one's prescriptive. And the third major difference I'd say is this: for the Christian, Jesus is the paradigm person, whereas for the Muslim, Muhammad is the paradigm person, right? In other words, I mean, not that I'm advocating the WWJD, what would Jesus do movement sort of thing, but there is a degree to which, if you want to look, who is the person who expresses Christian morality, you would clearly do well to look at Jesus, right? And Jesus lived such a peaceful life that many people mistake him for being a pacifist, right? You know, when Peter raised his sword, to defend Jesus, Jesus is like, "Hey, Peter, put away your sword. Those who live by the sword die by the sword," right? And then his last command before he rises into heaven was the Great Commission, which is to do what? Make disciples of all nations, right? Which is a persuasive enterprise. It is not a military enterprise, okay? That is not the model of Muhammad, who, when he gained political and military power after he traveled to Medina, he spent the next 11 years through military conquest conquering the Jews of Medina, conquering all the city of Medina, and eventually traveling back into Mecca and conquering all of Mecca. And then he commissioned his generals after he died to continue their expansion and conquered vast and massive portions of the earth, through military conquest. So when you look at these two people who exemplify Christian or Islamic morality, they're just vastly different.
So you do have like three different strains of evidence saying that jihad does seem to be an integral part who Islam at least is conceived of by Muhammad and the sources, even if that's not conceived of by most Muslims today, at least in the West.
That's right. And those three reasons are ways in which it is not parallel to the kinds of war and killing that we see in the Old Testament.
So one last thing, and this is going back to our discussion on methodology and approach to Islam. Can humor play a role in engaging in apologetics or evangelism? Because it's so interesting. Because if I were to talk to a Muslim, I would go very much the Surah 547 route, because for reasons we've already went into, a lot of the other stuff is irrelevant. However, Rock Solid Apologia is the world's one and only apologetic satire site, is kind of trying to be the Babylon Bee of apologetics, and we do use satire with Mormonism and with Islam. I'm not even sure the best way to put this, but does your gift of sarcasm have to be left at the door in these kinds of conversations if it's appropriate?
Well, my general answer would be no, but I would qualify, provided we are never using humor to mock people.
Right.
I'm very okay with humor. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I'm super sarcastic and always make jokes and involved in self-deprecating humor and all kinds of things, right? But provided, again, that we're never mocking people or saying jokes at the expense of people to degrade them or to insult them or to dehumanize them. That, to me, isn't an option. I'd say it's wrong to do that. So provided we're not doing that, yeah, I'm totally fine with humor. I think humor is a natural part of the human experience, and it builds relationships. It helps establish common ground. If you and a person, like say a Muslim or anyone you're talking to who you disagree with, if you can both laugh at something, that's totally amazing. That's wonderful. That's finding common ground and knitting your souls in that moment, knitting your conversation, knitting your relationship really well. So absolutely, if you can do that without violating the fact that they are made in God's image and deserve to be treated with dignity and respect.
It's a fine line, but somehow or another, people have to be catalysts. Like when you're doing satire, as we do on our website, people have to be catalysts for satire. They cannot be objects. So Muhammad can be a catalyst for examining an idea, but he can't be the object of mockery, to use a harsh term, in and of itself.
Right.
Now that gets murky, because where is he being the catalyst versus where is he being the object? Another thing is, like, how can you have people laugh with you, not just laughing at them?
Well, you don't have to use Muhammad as a person who's being the catalyst for your humor. Like, you could be laughing about all kinds of things, like something that happens to you,
right?
Maybe in a conversation, right. And a bird like flies like just past your head, and like, whoa, I almost got like taken out by God right there. Like, I don't know, I'm just making something up, but like, I would shy away from using Muhammad as a catalyst for humor, because I just don't know how someone's going to take it. I would look for other things, other points of connection to draw humor from those things rather than any kind of religious things.
Right, because humor doesn't have to be solely religious in nature. And there's also a difference between person-to-person interaction. I mean, podcasts should be gracious, but there's a difference between conveying information here versus having a one-on-one conversation with a Muslim. And there's also a difference between writing articles for an internet audience and sitting down with a person one-on-one. Now, again, that gets murky because you don't want to hide behind a screen, but it's like using tools wisely.
Yeah, I think one of the chief verses that's so relevant to us to stand to reason is 2 Corinthians 5:20, which says we are all ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making his appeal through us. I think that has to be foremost in our mind when we're engaging anyone who's not a believer, well, anyone in general, but if we're talking to non-believers as well, I think we have to remember, just think of yourself as an ambassador. How would an ambassador handle himself or herself if they are, let's say, a political ambassador, like you're a U.S. ambassador in Iran, right? And you're engaging in tense political, diplomatic, foreign affair issues, I mean, you might be able to find some touch points of humor here and there, but you want to be very careful about the kinds of things you joke about. You don't want to, make fun of them or make fun of their customs or their traditions, right?
King George put arsenic in his wig, even if it was unknowing. Maybe not the thing for John Adams to do when he goes to Britain.
Yes, right. So anyway, so I like to think of myself, because the Bible identifies us this, as an ambassador for Jesus Christ. So however we're coming across to other people, we have to remember is ultimately a reflection upon the good name of Jesus. So if you don't feel comfortable, having Jesus be a part of what you're saying, maybe you shouldn't say it.
And if you'd be ashamed to present whatever you wrote or whatever you did on a podcast when you're sitting one-on-one with someone, maybe it shouldn't be published.
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you again for joining us on the podcast. If people want to find more of Alan Shlemon, where can they go to look?
Well, our website's probably the best place, str.org. Our organization is called Stand to Reason. So str.org. We have free articles, free podcasts, free video courses. I just created a new video course curriculum on Islam, in fact. It's under, if you go to training on our website, it's called STRU, which stands for Stand to Reason University. And there's like dozens of courses, but the latest one is on Islam. So if you wanted to get my full teaching on Islam, you'd find it there for free.
And we will put a link to STR in the description box. With that wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, minus some satire today. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.